Welcome to Stuff You Missed in History Class, a production of iHeartRadio. Hello and happy Friday. I'm Holly Fry.
And I'm Tracy V. Wilson.
We talked about the Heveliuses this week.
Yeah.
I found it interesting that not a one of the write-ups I read even had a pause for a moment of, they would mention the age difference, but no one would be like, yeah, that's a little bit messed up.
Yeah.
They would be like, they were 36 years apart in age.
Right.
And I'm like, Are we going to acknowledge that that's a little weird, especially because she was a teenager?
Yeah. I feel like the last time this really came up on the show was on the Stakhanovite episode.
Yeah.
And we had talked about their age difference and how young she was. And a couple people got real mad about that. About that discussion. And it's like, yes, at other points in history and in other parts of the world still, including some parts of the United States, it still is very common for people to get married really young. But that doesn't mean that it's normal, really.
Right. I tend to look at the mean averages of women's ages at marriage tables when I can. And the ones that I looked at when I was putting this together all put the average marrying age for women in Poland at that time 20 to 23.
Yeah.
So she was squarely under that average.
Right. And I think sometimes people will look instead at whether it was legal, what was the youngest legal age for a person to legally get married. And a lot of times that was way younger than the age that people really did typically get married at. And people still saw those really, really effectively child marriages as not typical at best.
Here's always my thinking on that.
Mm-hmm.
If you have to invoke a law to be like, is this okay?
Yeah.
You're skirting some you're right up against whether or not you should actually be doing that.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's just my opinion.
We can put so much context into things. The way that we think of childhood and adolescence in the United States in the year 2024 is really different from how societies viewed childhood and adolescence hundreds of years ago.
Yeah.
But those observable power differences were still there, even if people thought of children and adolescents totally differently than how we do now, even if there wasn't really a concept of adolescence quite yet.
Right. Well, and that definitely is in play here, right? Because we talked about, he was famous already.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I should say most, a lot of teenagers in the, modern day, it's completely normal for them to be romantically fixated in a parasocial way on a famous person.
I absolutely did this myself as a teenager.
Almost everyone I know had a crush on some famous person when they were younger, right? That's not unusual at all. But then it's if that teenager went and met that famous person and said, I think you're great. I heard your wife just died. Even if that seems like they're the pursuer.
Right.
There's the onus at that point is on the mature adult to go
the adult. Yeah.
Yes, that is true. And I really appreciate it. Maybe we could reconnect again the years down the road. But it's not. It's just a little weird. I said, they seemed like they were very, very happy together. And I don't want to erase that or devalue that in any way. But it started in a very unusual way.
Yeah.
That was definitely right at the edge of social acceptability. And even writings about it are kind of oh, this is crazy. We're doing something crazy. So there's recognition that it wasn't maybe the most, it was not a standard situation at all. But I do like that, their whole story. I love this idea of an astronomer that is independent enough to just be I got money. I'll build a I'll build an observatory. That's cool.
Yeah.
I love that part. And also we didn't really get into this sort of pattern that his life followed with both of his wives, where he was fortunate enough to marry women who were like, yeah, I can take on more than the average person. Yeah, I'll run the businesses. Like his first wife, Katerina, was running their businesses, which was not her job. You know, that was not what she married into initially.
Yeah.
So he was fortunate in that regard.
Yeah. There are a lot of scientists, like across the scientists, for centuries who were really only able to do their work because of women in their lives, whether it was a wife or a sister or a daughter, with that person not just like keeping the household, doing things that were considered typical for women, but like also taking the notes, doing the measurements, compiling data, like all of this stuff. And sometimes those contributions aren't actually noted anywhere unless you really, really, really read between the lines, and sometimes not even then. So the acknowledgement here, I like that we actually know more about her contributions.
Me too. And there's one mention of her that comes up in another write-up that was like roughly 100 years later that is meant to be really complimentary, but manages to also be misogynist, because it's like, she was one of the only women who was up to the task of working alongside a man who was an astronomer. And it's like, I know you meant well here, dude.
Yeah.
But she also, as we said, was an outlier in that she too was from a wealthy family and probably got more education than the average person. Like, there was definitely some circumstantial privilege and opportunity in her life that most women would not have had. So it's easy to say she was great. And apparently everyone loved her. I mean, it's telling that she and Edmund Halley were buddies and they kept up a correspondence for a long time. I think that's sweet. I like the idea that, you know, they became good family friends, and I love all of that. But I'm also like, oh, you don't have to make it like she's the only woman that was ever capable of that. Like, we know otherwise, right?
We talked about Eustace the Monk this week.
Sure did.
This is a name that I stumbled across while doing the thing where I'm trying to figure out, did anything happen on this day in history that would be good Saturday Classic? And there was a reference to Eustace the Monk being beheaded at the Battle of Sandwich, and I thought that sounds interesting. And I felt like this was the first time I had ever heard of Eustace the Monk. That's not true. Because I also heard of Eustace the Monk years and years ago when writing an episode about who the real Robin Hood is, which we're going to run as a Saturday Classic. And then not only did I forget having come across the name Eustace the Monk, I forgot I had written that whole episode.
Happens to me all the time.
Yeah. I would have really been, I was very confident that it was an episode that predated our time on the show. I knew it was an episode that existed. No, I wrote it. I wrote it in something like 2013.
Listen, after a decade, all bets are off, for sure.
It's not in our brains anymore. So a lot of this episode was very fun, and I chose it because I thought it sounded fun. Even though sometimes pirates can be gruesomely violent. I was like, this whole story of a monk that left the monastery to become a pirate sounds like a potential source of a lot of things that would be fun to talk about. And it was. But then I also was like, oh no, I have to explain all of this dispute between England and France. And a bunch of royal drama, which is just often not my favorite. And in this case, it was one of those things where there were just layers and layers and layers I would think I had gotten to the earliest thing that would needed to be explained, and then I would realize there was some other earlier or adjacent thing that also needed to be explained, including how Arthur wound up being fostered at French court. And that really was, I was like, this is a whole other convoluted story. It's not actually related to this episode. If I try to explain it, it's going to be a whole additional digression. So I had gotten through all that part, and I had moved on to the actual piracy stuff, which was back to being generally more fun. But then I was like, now I have to explain the Magna Carta. Was not expecting to need to explain the Magna Carta, along with all of this English and French royal disputes and warfare. Even with all that, it was still fun, though.
I always crack up anytime the story of Reynard the Fox is mentioned on the show. Because this the silliest name of all time.
It is very silly.
Fox the Fox.
Fox the Fox, yeah.
Which actually, that would be a great name for a band, Fox the Fox.
I wonder if there is a band called Fox the Fox.
Surely there is. I also, in thinking about Eustace, he reminds me so much of The Adventures of Baron Munchausen.
Oh, sure.
Especially once it gets into the magic, where it's like, if you took all that out, you could be like, yeah, this is a guy that had a wild life, and it's like, wait, he did what now?
Yeah. So much of the things that come up in the romance are just like, they're the kinds of things that happen all over medieval literature. And so, there's just, like we talked about and kind of cracked up over in a part that we had to get our act together and get back to recording. There's just a lot of coarse humor, including lots of farting. Some of it reminded me of things like the Canterbury Tales and how some of the Canterbury Tales are pretty lewd. And that is the case of some of the Eustace the Monk stuff. I don't know, it reminded me of so many different things that we've talked about on the show before, or that, I studied in college literature classes that are still kind of hilarious and silly and maybe a little juvenile in terms of the level of humor.
Yeah. I also have an association that is very silly. I don't know that it would also ping with you. But anytime we discuss the Battle of Sandwich, I think about the Futurama episode where Fry gets worms from eating a truck stop sandwich.
Right.
And those worms make him very smart and strong. And then through technological shrinking, he's able to go into his own body and have a thing. But the best part is the Worm King who says, you think you can get rid of me? My family came over on the sandwich. And that's what I think of anytime there's any sandwich-related battle mention.
That is probably the first thing I think of anytime anyone mentions that entire show.
Really? Not Jurassic Bark, which is one of the most painful things of all time?
That's like the runner-up.
I would say but
it
it's
is
good.
One or the other of those two things.
What an incredibly smart writer's room.
Yeah.
And now there's new Futurama, in case anybody didn't know.
I have not seen it.
On Hulu has a new season of it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm always here for more Futurama. All day, every day.
Yeah.
That entire voice. There are things that Tress MacNeille does in her various characters that she does that even now, watching the show, years and years later from when it first came out, will just strike me in a new way and tickle me to death, and I will fall into fits of giggles like I am a 7-year-old, and I love it. I love it!
Yeah.
That's all for Futurama. My family came over on the sandwich. That's all I
got. This episode also reminded me of how many years ago we talked about how it would be cool if there was a website that you could just put in a year and it would tell you if England was at war with France. And then 2 different listeners of the podcast each made websites to do that very thing. I don't know if either of them is still active because I did not check before coming in here. And this was many, 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 many years ago at this point. But yeah, the many, many centuries of warfare between England and France. Mm-hmm. Things that you could explain forever in an episode about a pirate.
Yeah. That's, full of stuff that isn't 100% substantiatable.
Yeah.
Which is a new word I maybe just made up.
I think it's fine.
I always kind of love these because even if those things can't be substantiated, what that document, that story does is tell us a lot about the writer and perceived audience of that work.
Oh, sure.
And so that becomes historically significant in its own way, where he's like, you know what I got to do to really make people pay attention to this? Black magic. And then he talked with the devil.
Yeah, months in an underground chamber talking directly to the devil. Yeah, so he was incredibly infamous during his lifetime and for a bit afterward. And I don't know when he became less of a well-known figure. But I found a couple of things that had been written in the 19th century that were like, yeah, this guy's really obscure now. He used to be so famous. I don't know how long he had been really obscure now by that point, though.
Those instances of people who were once famous and are now obscure are also, to me, just a good mental leveler of anxiety, because it just reminds me that no matter what thing is going on in my life or the world that I'm getting very worked up over, people are going to forget it. It's not that important.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, obviously we want to fight injustice still, but like various other little bickery things.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter. It's all fine. People will forget.
I think he is a character in a mobile version of an Assassin's Creed game that I never played because it existed before I had been really introduced to that whole franchise. And it's no longer something that you can get or play anymore. Because, it was made to run on obsolete iPhones and is no longer in the App Store.
Right.
It's possible somebody has made an emulator of it or something somewhere. I didn't look that hard, but there was an Assassin's Creed Pirates that Eustace the Monk is in.
Yeah.
Anyway, whatever's happening on your weekend, if there's video games involving pirates, or maybe actual pirates, hopefully only in a fun way. Or, if you got to work, I hope everybody's great to you. We will be back with a Saturday Classic tomorrow, which I think is going to be that episode on who the real Robin Hood was that I forgot I wrote. And then we'll be back with a brand new episode on Monday. Stuff You Missed in History Class is a production of iHeartRadio. For more podcasts from iHeartRadio, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.